Hello, my name is Iman, and today I will be discussing the sonic hedgehog signaling pathway in the development of the central nervous system and its role in neurodegenerative diseases. And with me today to help me is Sonic the Hedgehog, who will be helping me explain this process to you.
Let's go!
Here is a quick overview of hedgehog signaling before we continue. Hedgehog signaling is one of the few pathways that is used during development for intercellular communication. These hedgehog proteins are vital for organogenesis, which is the process by which the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm develop into the internal organs of the organism. The primary cilium, also abbreviated to PC, is an organelle that is microtubule-based and processes several cellular signals. When we discuss the pathway in greater detail, we will see the role of primary cilium in the pathway.
Cool!
There are other hedgehog proteins besides sonic. One is called the Indian hedgehog protein, which is involved in skeletal development. The other is desert hedgehog protein, which is involved in the development of the organs that produce gametes, such as the ovaries and testes. But for now, we will be discussing sonic hedgehog protein today.
Roger that, buddy.
The sonic hedgehog protein diffuses through the embryo, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient is called the morphogene gradient. The morphogene gradient is a mechanism by which the emission of a signal from one part of an embryo can determine the location, differentiation, and fate of many surrounding cells.
Piece of cake! What is that thing?
There are actually two pathways for sonic hedgehog. One is called the cannon pathway, and the other is called the non-cannon pathway. However, we will be discussing the cannon pathway and how it is done through receptor-induced signaling. The cannon pathway consists of three components: passed, smoothened, and gill. And below is a diagram of the two pathways. One, the other pathway, is done with a gill-dependent signaling, and the other is done in the non-cannon signaling with second messengers and slash signaling molecules. This is a transmembrane protein and inhibitor receptor known as PAST. Under normal conditions, PAST inhibits the activity of smoothen protein, inhibiting the downstream path. Smoothen is a signaling receptor and a G protein coupled receptor. When the Sonic the Hedgehog protein isn't present, SUFU binds to GIL proteins and inhibits their translocation to the nucleus. Sonic the Hedgehog protein binding to PAST regulates smoothing activity. When Sonic the Hedgehog protein does bind to PAST at the cell membrane, PAST no longer inhibits smoothing. This leads to smoothing accumulating at the PC primary cilium and initiates the downstream signaling pathway. Smoothing regulates the GIL processing activation at the primary cilium. When GIL is activated, it translocates to the nucleus, where it activates target genes. When the path is activated, SUFU inhibition of GIL occurs by hyperphosphorylation of sulfur. Now, pK plays a negative regulatory role during this process. And when PAS does bind with Sonic the Hedgehog protein, another thing to keep in mind is that the microtubule complex enters the nucleus to activate the downstream target gene transcription.
Pretty cool, huh?
The role of Sonic the Hedgehog pathway in the development of central nervous system is that it facilitates the differentiated capacities of the precursor cells, which involve coordinating size, shape, and cell type. Precursor cells are cells with the capacity to differentiate into only one cell type. The signaling pathway also regulates the growth of radial glial cells and intermediary precursor cells to maintain the survival of neocortex neurons. The neocortex is the top layer of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, during the embryonic development, this pathway plays a decisive role in regulating the development of stem cells. It also induces the development of other tissues or organs, such as the formation of eyes.
Pretty cool, huh?
The sonic hedgehog pathway is also involved in the development of the ventral, hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. It helps to ensure the normal foundation of the ventral structure. It also helps form the shape of the brain.
Sweet!
Now, Sonic the Hedgehog signaling also affects neurodegenerative diseases. Neurodegenerative diseases are characterized mostly by their protein toxicity and neurotransmitter deficiency. Sonic the Hedgehog signaling maintains the neural stem cells and promotes the formation of oligodendrocytes, which are myelinated cells of the central nervous system. The signaling pathway is also involved in the development and differentiation of nerve cells. However, the abnormal Sonic the Hedgehog signaling pathway can lead to a variety of nervous system diseases that we will discuss.
What?
One of these neurodegenerative diseases is Alzheimer's disease, which is characterized by progressive memory decline as well as cognitive impairment. Now, under normal circumstances, high levels of PAS, which is promoted by sonic hedgehog protein and the transcription factor GIL, plays a role in the neural stem cells of Alzheimer's disease. However, more evidence is needed by scientists in order to be conclusive, but there is a relationship between them. Now, GPC, which is the loss of GPC, which is caused by the out of control of PAS, is seen as one of the reasons cognitive impairment of the brain happens in Alzheimer's disease. Another supporting evidence for this is that in developing central nervous system, sonic hedgehog protein has been shown to affect the growth and survival of precursor cells. The next neurodegenerative disease that we're going to talk about is Parkinson's disease.
Ah, no!
Unlike Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease actually has some good news. Now, but first, Parkinson's disease is the disease that's characterized by the degeneration and death of dopaminergic neurons. Now, Sonic the Hedgehog pathway represses these dopaminergic neuron deaths. And another role it also plays is that it actually can be a therapeutic agent for neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease, specifically Parkinson's disease, because it can protect these neurons that lead to Parkinson's disease. It could actually be used as an effective procedure against this disease. On this slide, I wanted to show the difference between the cell of a healthy person and the cell of a person with Parkinson's disease. Now, the healthy person has the sonic hedgehog signaling pathway normal and is functioning as it should. However, in a person with Parkinson's disease, now below is the cell of a person with Parkinson's disease. And here, the signaling pathway is abnormal and there's not much sonic hedgehog signaling happening, which is creating issues. Luckily, there are plenty of studies being done that show the therapeutic value of sonic hedgehog signaling, and hopefully there will be many therapeutic procedures that could lead to alleviating the symptoms of Parkinson's disease and help a lot of people.
That is great! We'll see you around!